Good morning, everyone. I'm Congressman John Faso, representing the 19th Congressional District, and I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues in representing various associations, and they will shortly introduce themselves as they have an opportunity to speak. And I appreciate everyone coming today. Today I'm announcing the introduction of legislation in the Congress which will go towards solving one of the perennial problems which New York State has in terms of the cost of government, the cost of doing business. New York State continues to see an exodus of people and jobs from our state. Most counties upstate, including every single county of the 11 in the 19th Congressional District, have seen population declines in the past 5 years, and many over the last few decades. School district census continues to fall virtually everywhere. Upstate New York is being hollowed out by policies which make our state the worst in the nation in which to do business. We rank either 49th or 50th in the nation in terms of business climate. Our constituents routinely tell me that their kids and grandchildren leave because there are not the job opportunities in upstate New York, and that they themselves are contemplating leaving upon retirement because they can't pay the real estate taxes. Poor public policy decisions have allowed our state to go on into an long extended period of decline. The size of our congressional delegation, which I am acutely aware of, over 40 strong just a few decades ago, is now down to 27, and after the 2020 census, it will be reduced to 26. Simply put, people are voting with their feet to get out of New York State. The legislation I am introducing in Congress attempts to address one of the many factors which makes our state too expensive to do business. The bill would require states to maintain a comparative negligence standard on all construction projects using federal dollars. The bill applies to all states, but since New York is the only state in the union with a strict liability standard on construction projects, the practical effect is that this bill will only affect the state of New York. The strict liability standard in New York law raises the cost of construction projects by an estimated 7%, and indeed that may be a conservative number. We estimate that the Tappan Zee Bridge project costs are increased by approximately $200 million by this strict liability standard. The cost of a typical single-family home in New York State on average will be increased by approximately $5,000 to $10,000 depending on where you are in the state because of New York's scaffold law. Projects like Gateway, where the state seeks approximately $7 billion from Washington for this $13 billion twin tunnel project between New York City and New Jersey, and which is absolutely essential to the entire Northeast economy. That project will cost hundreds of millions of dollars more in unnecessary liability costs due to this unreasonable New York State law. And think of it, on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, the project will be governed by a comparable negligence standard. On the New York side of the Hudson River, it'll be strict liability. Keep in mind that 49 other states utilize a comparative negligence standard, allowing a project owner and contractor to introduce a defense to a liability claim. Only New York State has this strict liability standard, and even New York uses comparable negligence in civil damage cases in other areas. Only in construction cases relating to gravity-related falls does New York State use strict liability. Keep in mind also that reforming this law would not adversely affect worker safety. We have no better safety record due to strict liability than do our competitor states. If workers were safer due to the New York scaffold law, I wouldn't be making this proposal, but they are not. Simply put, the current system is a gross waste of taxpayer dollars to taxpayers and to the private economy. We could build more infrastructure, creating more construction jobs and more prosperity if we don't continue to saddle our economy with these unnecessary construction liability costs. Mine is the first federal proposal of its kind. I intend to seek passage of this bill either as a standalone measure or as part of any federal infrastructure legislation. This plan will save taxpayer money and create more construction jobs and improve our needed infrastructure in New York State. And perhaps it will finally nudge the governor and the legislature to completely reform the law so that projects which don't rely on federal funds in the private sector can finally be relieved of this useless mandate. I'm joined today by a broad cross-section of, come on up Denise, a broad cross-section of representatives from the construction sector and the not-for-profit sector as well. And I'm pleased now to turn over the podium to Mike Elmendorf of AGC, and our colleagues will introduce themselves and make a presentation as well. I appreciate everyone coming today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Michael.
Let me start really just by saying thank you. You know, this is a big deal obviously for the industry that I represent, which builds infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, buildings, schools, basically everything but single family homes all across New York State. And this is an issue that has challenged our members, first with its manifest unfairness. They're being held responsible for accidents that they may have had nothing to do with. And so I want to thank you on their behalf, because this is a tough issue. Those who pay attention to what goes on in Albany know that this has been talked about here for a long time. It's been talked about when you were in Albany. It's one of those things when you go to talk to people about it, they may even roll their eyes because they say, oh no, you're here to talk about that again. But to take this issue on as you are, Congressman, and in this political environment to do it the way that you are, it's leadership and it's courage, and I think all of us up here agree that we want to thank you for that, and we wish we had more folks that were willing to do what you're doing here today. But this isn't just a big issue for the construction industry, because as the Congressman said, this is something that literally is impacting and raising costs and hurting every man, woman, and child in the state of New York. Whether you're a school kid, particularly in New York City, that may be going to school in a dilapidated building that can't be rebuilt because of the money that's being hemorrhaged on this unfair, unjust, I dare say un-American law. Whether you're a victim of a natural disaster, and you'll hear a little bit about this, whose ability to rebuild their home or their business has been hamstrung by this law. Whether you're a property taxpayer, paying the highest property tax burden in the country, in part because of this law, because every project that every school district, town, county, village, city in the state constructs, they too are held absolutely liable. Because the absolute liability standard of the scaffold law doesn't just apply to contractors like our members, it applies to the owner too. So all those owners, farmers, school districts, everybody, private employers are being sued and held absolutely responsible without the ability to defend themselves. Think about that. In America, that's what's happening. This is one of these things where I go talk to my colleagues around the country that represent this industry, and you tell them what's going on in your state, and you talk about the scaffold law. And they look at you and they say, well, I'm sure it's bad. I'm sure it's really bad. But it can't be that bad, right? There's got to be a little bit of hyperbole here. It is that bad, and it's only in New York. And so what the Congressman is doing today is protecting all of those groups, and as he said, it's protecting construction workers too. Because this law, despite what the few who try to defend it say, it is making construction sites less safe. And here's why. Because the contractors like our members who invest the time, the energy, the resources, the training in safety, in rigorous safety programs, and enforce them at their job sites and create safe workplaces, as every contractor should, for their workers, are treated the same way in court as those bad actors that you read about in some of the New York City tabloids and elsewhere, that when there's an accident, they go running away from the scene. Those people have no business in this industry. They should be penalized. They should be held responsible when a worker is injured. But under this law, you know what? Because the facts don't matter, they're treated the same way in court, and they're treated in the same way by insurance when they go to get insurance, because your loss history doesn't matter. So thank you for protecting the workers too, and frankly protecting the taxpayers of America. Because we need to rebuild our state, we need to rebuild our country, and we're doing less of it than we should be able to do in New York because of this law. It's high time that it changed, and thank you for taking the lead on this today.
Thank you.
And it's now a pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, President and CEO, there she is behind me, President and CEO of the Business Council of New York State, Heather Bruschetti.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Congressman Faso, for, I think, this very courageous legislation. The Business Council of New York State has long advocated for the repeal of the scaffold law. Years ago, our Public Policy Institute put out a report called Unique New York, and it was not a positive way in which New York is unique. Actually, it highlighted some of the unique difficulties faced by New Yorkers because of laws basically in place by our legislature, and obviously highlights the scaffold law. New York is the only state that has this, and we care about this because it's about jobs, it's about the cost of infrastructure in the state, and because, as Mike mentioned, it impacts every single taxpayer who supports school districts, who supports fire departments and police departments, all of which have infrastructure that costs more in New York than anywhere else because of this law. It's estimated that repealing the scaffold law in New York would result in 27,000 plus new construction jobs. And if we were to estimate what that would mean over time, that's not just 1 year, that's additional jobs every year that could be building new structures and saving taxpayers money and protecting the workers in a way that is much more effective than the existing system. One state had a scaffold law, did repeal it, saw a reduction in workplace injuries. So I think it's very hard to argue that the scaffold law actually protects workers. In fact, as Mike mentioned, it may disincentivize those bad actors from putting in place safety programs because essentially it doesn't benefit them in any way because they're going to be held strictly liable either way. I am also pleased to introduce the next person, which is Judith Nelson, who is the President and CEO of Habitat for Humanity of New York State. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Representative Faso, for this opportunity to come before you and speak on behalf of the millions of New Yorkers that do not have access to safe, affordable housing. While we consider the future of the scaffold law, let us not forget that the Tappan Zee Bridge is not the only impacted project that is experiencing increased cost. Increased costs and decreased availability of insurance have significant impacts on Habitat and all the providers of affordable housing within the state of New York. To deliver the housing that New Yorkers so desperately need, volunteer community-based organizations are particularly impaired by these laws. And because often insurance is completely unavailable to them. So for example, Habitat's efforts to address some of the Sandy devastation in downstate New York had to be closed because they couldn't find the insurance that was necessary in order to cover the volunteers that were there. Access to insurance shouldn't keep communities from working together to address the problems that we experience. It is critical that as communities, we strive to protect our members, that our communities thrive, and that we have opportunities for all. Working together, we can build a New York that everyone can afford. Please join me in addressing the issues presented by Labor Law 240, 241, and thank you for your attention. It is now my pleasure to introduce Denise Richardson from the General Contractors Association.
Thank you, and I want to thank you, Congressman Faso, for raising this very important issue. I just want to put one metric in everybody's head, 10%. So when your town is going to build a new library or a new school, or if you live in the downstate region, the MTA is going to do a capital project to improve service on your line, or any other project around the state of New York, 10% of that project cost goes to insurance. When you add up all of the initiatives that all of the states, the state has throughout all of the towns, 10% of the entire budget for any project goes solely for insurance. It is the biggest barrier to entry for new firms seeking to become a construction contractor. It is the biggest barrier for firms to grow because once they have an insurance level, it's very difficult for them to get insurance at the next level. And for contractors that do business around the country, their insurance costs in New Jersey and even in California, which is also a highly regulated state, is half the cost it is in New York. So as we compete for federal funds with other states around the country who can demonstrate that they can bring their projects in at a much lower cost, just remember that one of the biggest barriers for our competitive advantage in seeking federal funds is the scaffold law. And for this reason, I thank you so much for raising the issue, because without you bringing it to the attention, we've talked about this for years in the state legislature and nothing has gotten done. So just remember today, 10%, and when you vote, remember that as well. And I'd like to introduce Josh Reed, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Joshua Reap. I am with the Associated Builders and Contractors. And much like many of the other associations represented here today, my contractors are negatively affected by this law, but not only them, but also the communities in which they work. Scaffold law exists only here in New York, and it hasn't made anyone safer. Anyone that supports the continuation of scaffold law, I don't think any of them can actually prove that it's actually made the environment safer. It's a draconian law that predates many of the modern safety practices that we have today. Our contractors are committed to safety, accountability, and providing a good, safe, positive work environment. And at the same time, they have to struggle here in one of the most difficult states to work. Quite frankly, instead, the scaffold law has driven up costs and prevented a lot of construction from happening, which means it's prevented a lot of jobs from being afforded to people here in New York. And as the Congressman said, people vote with their feet. People have gone to other states searching for opportunity. Let's bring some of that opportunity back here to New York. Construction is one of the best economic generators in the country. I don't think that's anything anyone would ever refute. I think by reforming the scaffold law in this way, we can demonstrate to Albany that it can be fixed, and it can be done right and help to increase the number of jobs and opportunities here in our own state. I've spoken with many small contractors that have said this has been a big barrier to them to be able to get that next job, to continue their growth, their opportunity here in the state. So let's do something about this here too. We're very happy to support the Congressman and his bill. And I think next up I'd like to introduce Jermaine White.
Thank you for having me. My name is Jermaine White. I'm the owner of Jal Housing Inc. We're an MBE firm located in Rensselaer, New York. The scaffold law has affected my business because it has affected me by not allowing me to hire any more contractors or employees because of the increasing cost of insurance. My business is mainly owning and renting property, and that has slowed me down because the increasing cost of renovations and trying to go out and get loans for cost has made it difficult. And I would like to see this law get passed so I could expand my business and help my community expand as well. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Jermaine.
Thank you.
Okay, where's Tom? You want to say something? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all the groups that are here. We have a press statements from each of them, as well as from Assemblyman John McDonald, who's a sponsor of this legislation in the state legislature. And I understand that Senator Akshar is introducing legislation in the legislature as well. The key for me is that we spend hundreds of millions of dollars each year, and indeed, when Gateway happens, the state is seeking upwards of $7 billion from the federal government to build those necessary twin tunnels between New Jersey and New York. The costs and the liability costs that are included in that are extraordinary. It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That will be unnecessary liability costs that will be incurred by taxpayers, federal taxpayers and state taxpayers, in order to build that project. We shouldn't waste taxpayer dollars. We should get more construction done with our taxpayer dollars, not less. So I'm pleased now to open it up to any questions that anyone might have for me or my colleagues here today.
Congressman, you've got this bill, you've got the Medicaid bill, Congressman Collins has a SAFE Act bill. It sort of seems like there's been a bit of a trend in introducing legislation that would impact New York specifically at the congressional level. And I'm just curious, I mean, is this the way that you all see impacting New York policy in a legislature environment that wouldn't otherwise take up these causes?
Well, you know, Matt, I thought of the Medicaid amendment, and I'm still committed to that. I was pleased to be able to draft it and get it in the House legislation and the Senate legislation, but we know that effort fell apart. But I'm still committed to that. And so I thought of that Medicaid legislation when I was campaigning last year. A property owner and a business owner in Ulster County told me that between his business and his home, which were on adjacent properties, he pays $20,000 a year in real estate taxes. And he says, I remember his quote, he said, "I have to sell a lot of hamburgers and a lot of beer in order to make $20,000. So the impetus on this scaffold law change was also something from my years of experience in Albany. I know what this means, and I know what it costs both the nonprofit sector, organizations like Habitat for Humanity, and the housing groups that build affordable housing projects, but also the contractors who build projects large and small in our state, private roofers, home builders, etc. We have extraordinary amounts of federal dollars that are being spent. So my idea about the federal dollars was to link the receipt of the federal dollars to the recipient of those dollars agreeing to a comparative negligence standard. And this is something that is completely within the prerogative of Congress. Congress should not have taxpayer money, federal tax dollars wasted unnecessarily. And the scaffold law is a perfect example of state law impacting and costing federal dollars more than it should. So it really, I don't see them as being related. I just see it as a product of my experience here in Albany, knowing the things that we need to fix in upstate New York and throughout the state to make our state a better place to do business, a better place for jobs, and a better place to get things done.
Just to follow up on that point, do you feel now, as a member of the House majority, you have a better ability to impact some of those policies you've been working on for years than you did when you were with the minority in the Assembly?
Well, I do, and it gives me a different perspective on that process. But look at Gateway. Look at the Tappan Zee Bridge. Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent each year on affordable housing projects, on community development. FEMA, the story that Judith relating to Habitat for Humanity. We heard this, the Sandy aid, which many communities and many homeowners are still trying to get redress from that disaster in 2011. Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee in my district. So all of these reconstruction, rebuilding projects are financed in large part with federal dollars. Federal dollars, as you know, my belief is that federal dollars shouldn't be wasted. And the liability law and the liability standard in New York wastes federal dollars on unnecessarily high liability insurance costs.
Not to assume, but the president is a prominent New York developer. I'm sure that he's well aware of what the scaffold law is. Do you have plans to go to the White House and say, when you guys do the infrastructure bill, think about this. You're keenly aware of this issue.
I'm going to work with the executive and with my colleagues in the legislative branch in Congress to try to make sure that we get this enacted one way or another, either as a standalone bill or as part of the infrastructure package.
Is there a companion bill in the federal Senate?
No, but I'm only introducing this bill this week in the House, and I'll be looking for support over there. But the first thing that I'm going to do as a House member, and the way we've drafted this bill, it'll go to a single committee, the Judiciary Committee, and I'm going to work hard to make sure we get it through that committee.
Do you think that either of New York's senators will sponsor this?
I would hope so. I would hope they would, and I will certainly bring it to both New York senators, because I think they certainly are aware of the impact of unnecessarily high and burdensome liability rules on the construction sector in our state.
And then maybe Mike, or what percentage are we talking about of construction in the state is this going to impact? Like how much of the construction market, plus or minus, is federally financed?
It is very hard to quantify that, because if you're dealing with, say, a private developer who builds single-family homes, there are no federal dollars attached to that. So
right.
This legislation wouldn't affect it. If you're a homeowner, looking to replace your roof on your home, you, the owner of the property, and the contractor are strictly liable if someone is injured in a gravity-related fall, regardless of whether that employee was drunk, for instance, on the ladder, or violated safety rules, etc. There's no ability to introduce a defense. Everywhere else in New York law, if you have civil liability action that's brought, you can introduce a defense of comparative negligence, but you can't in this context. So I'm hopeful that we can get our senators and others involved in supporting this. And I want to work with everyone, the construction trades and everyone, in trying to fashion legislation that will work for everyone, but it's critical that we get this law changed.
And Jimmy, just I would,
go ahead.
Denise may have something to add on this too,
Denise.
but certainly on the transportation infrastructure side, the federal government spends over $3 billion a year in New York between roads and bridges, highways, and transit. Then you've got obviously FEMA activity, you've got federal support of affordable housing, probably a lot of other smaller buckets of funding. Clearly this doesn't impact every project. It doesn't impact a lot of local government projects that may not have federal dollars. But we do think, though, and we've talked to the insurance industry about this, is that it will create enough of a change in New York that you will have a return to market by insurance carriers. Because there's two problems here, right? There's the cost which is astronomical for our contractors around the state. And then there's the availability, because you've got less than a handful of insurance companies you can go talk to try to get insurance, whereas in any other state you've got 25 or 30, right? So it doesn't work very well for them. So they believe it will bring carriers back to market, which will bring prices down on those projects that now have a rational risk environment with a comparative negligence standard. But it will also create a very stark contrast between the experience and the cost of projects that have absolute liability without federal funding and those that operate under comparative negligence. Because you're going to see much less losses, you're going to see fewer claims, you're going to see lower costs. How do we know it? Well, you can go ask them for confirmation, but the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey runs their own insurance program, gave us their data a few years ago. There are bridges between New York and New Jersey. Somewhere on that bridge is an imaginary dotted line, and over here you're in New Jersey, over here you're in New York, much like Gateway. On the New York side of those bridges, they have twice as many losses and claims as they do on the New Jersey side, where you don't have an absolute liability standard. These bridges are pretty level. They're not built like this so that they list to the New York side and you think that more people are getting hurt on the New York side. There's a law that incentivizes higher costs and higher losses in New York, and it's this law.
Remember also historically that half of state DOT's program is federally funded and 25% of the MTAs is federally funded. So right there, you have an immediate impact, and as Mike raised earlier, it's going to force a change in the larger insurance market in New York, which is really what I think the goal of this is.
But you're saying about $3 billion a year just on
Transportation infrastructure.
Right.
And it's a higher number than that, obviously, because, you know, and the FEMA number, we hope we don't run up those numbers anytime soon, but that fluctuates depending on what's happening. I mean, across the board, there's a lot of federal support for construction in New York.
And I think,
Go ahead.
I think certainly when you talk about Gateway, this is an immediate policy change that we need to make happen if we expect the federal government to realistically fund half the project. It's an important issue because of the size and the scope of Gateway.
Another area where there's significant federal resources, the state revolving loan funds are in large part funded through federal dollars. So the water and sewer projects, those upgrades throughout our state affecting so many communities would be affected by this. You use federal dollars, you shouldn't be able to waste them. And I want to see all the federal dollars go for construction, go for construction jobs. I don't want them to go for unnecessary construction liability insurance costs.
Hard to
Yes,
ignore,
sir.
Congressman, that while you say this will be good for workers and the workers will be safer under scaffold reform law, organized labor is not represented here today. Have you reached out? I imagine they disagree with you.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of representatives of organized labor, and we're not in full agreement on this, obviously, but I do think there's a basis for an ultimate agreement. I hope there is, because my goal is their goal, which is more construction jobs, more construction activity, more infrastructure being built in New York State. And look, I think if people sit and look, 49 states in the Union do it one way, and New York does it another way. And this is one of the many straws on the camel's back of the economy that's causing people to flee our state. People are voting with their feet. They're leaving New York State. Upstate New York is being hollowed out. When you think 40 years ago, we had over 40, I think we had 43 members of Congress representing this state in Washington. Today we have 27, and after 2020 it'll be 26, because people continue to leave our state. And we have created a perverse incentive for people to leave, and because we do not have the business climate that we need in order to facilitate more jobs, more employment, more prosperity. That's what this is all about.